welcome to our esteemed panelists, David Rothchild from the Skoll Foundation, Chevenee Reavis from Water.org, and Manoj Fenelon from Pepsico Foundation. Welcome, and also welcome to our South by Southwest participants and to our community members here in Austin. We're kicking off the morning with an energetic panel titled Water for All, Innovation and Action in the Developing World. Today, nearly 1 billion people don't have affordable access to clean water. And clean water supply and sanitation are inextricably linked with health. Every 20 seconds, a child dies from a water-related disease, and globally, the second leading cause of death among children under 5. And without access to clean water supplies, it is difficult to address poverty, famine, and health issues at all. There are many dedicated people and organizations around the world focused on providing access to clean water for every person on the planet. Billions of dollars have been spent in the interest of WASH, which is, I was happy to learn a new thing for this, shorthand for Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene initiatives around the world. Notably, 330,000 new water customers have been created by Water.org's Water Credit Initiative alone. Yet while progress is being made, the valiant and big-hearted work of missionaries, service agencies, and governments, and others have not solved the problem. Furthermore, it seems like some of the progress has not resulted in lasting changes. It is estimated that 30 to 60% of installed water pumps are either not working or are going without maintenance. And globally, billions of people, mostly girls and women, have to walk daily past broken water taps and hand pumps back to polluted water sources they hoped were a thing of the past. We are fortunate to have with us three truly visionary and innovative individuals who are forwarding newer approaches to solving this global challenge, to provide access to clean and affordable water for all. David Rothchild is the principal of the Skoll Foundation and their portfolio team. He manages a variety of key relationships with social entrepreneurs, domain experts, policymakers, and corporate partners and co-funders. David develops and structures funding opportunities to drive large-scale change, and his particular focus is on innovation and change around deforestation and the WASH sector. Again, that's water, sanitation, and hygiene. And for more than 7 years, he lived and worked in South America with the Amazon Alliance. Chevenee Reavis leads Water.org's global advocacy efforts and the New Venture Fund initiative. With a decade of experience advancing the impact of leading foundations, government agencies, Fortune 500 companies, and nonprofit organizations, Chevenee came to Water.org in 2010 to develop new types of collaboration and innovation. She is working to accelerate the impact of Water.org, as well as solutions in the water and sanitation sector. She's an accomplished fundraiser, a driver of organizational innovation, a strategic consultant, and an author of a variety of papers, including resources for organizations like the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Management at Harvard University. And Manoj Fenelon helps imagine desirable futures for PepsiCo's beverage brands and businesses. He looks for opportunities to create new value where business and social interests intersect. Manoj is a first mover fellow of the Aspen Institute and a frequent speaker at Foresight trend conferences. I've learned from Chevenee that Pepsico Foundation has invested in some of the most out-of-the-box opportunities to solve water challenges around the world. She says that they are totally forward-looking and advancing some of the best solutions out there. Water credit was one of those models. Without them, Water.org wouldn't be where it is today. So, to start off the questions in the panel, David, could you give us an overview about what's going on in the world of water, paint a picture of water availability, water access, clean water, that sort of thing?
Sure, thank you. And thank you to all the organizers here at South by Southwest. It's really an honor to be here. When we think about water as an issue, and water and sanitation, water, sanitation, hygiene, the WASH sector is sort of one of the centerpieces of the water issue. I want to start off by thinking about all of the water that's on the planet. And 97.5% of all the water on the planet is in the oceans. It's salt water. That leaves a very small amount that are the freshwater resources. And of that small amount, the majority of that is in ice or snow, and then groundwater. But the actual surface water that is freshwater resources for us to use is a tiny, 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 tiny percentage of the water available. And it's a limited resource that we as humans have to manage and think about how we're going to use going forward. Right now, the demand for water exceeds the amount of freshwater resources on the planet. We've just started to reach that point. And it's expected as we go from 7 to 9 billion people in the next 30 years that that's almost going to double. The demand is about to double. If that demand doubles, but the amount of resources stays the same, we're not getting more fresh water than what we already have. We're going to have to find innovative ways to reduce water use. And most of the water use in the world is actually agriculture, irrigation. It is the vast majority of how freshwater resources are used. So we need really strong innovations in the agriculture sector that can drive down water resource use. Things like drip irrigation need to expand dramatically. Things like pivot irrigation for larger scale farms need to be expanded across many parts of the world. Ways to irrigate and feed the world with using less water. And industry has a huge role to play as well. And Pepsi has done a fabulous job of sort of modeling a way forward, and we're going to hear about that later. But in the wash sector, which is a piece that has to do with water and sanitation and hygiene, we're looking at how do we reach by 2030, if the goal that has been articulated by the president of the World Bank is end extreme poverty by 2030, if we're going to reach that, we have to reach water and sanitation for everybody by 2030, way beyond what the Millennium Development Goals set out as a target. And while we have reached the Millennium Development Goal for water, according to some, the sanitation one is way behind. There's a lot of work to be done in sanitation. I can go on, but I'll let you continue.
Would either of you like to add something about the big picture of what you see? What's going on?
Hi, thank you very much, and thanks everybody for coming out this morning. First session on the day after a big night at South by Southwest, and with 1 hour loss. So thank you guys for coming. So I would just sort of echo what you've just said, David, in terms of by 2030, what an enormous and ambitious goal that is. Sort of technically, and when we think about where the Millennium Development Goals are today, and the world is in process now to sort of vision cast what is the next chapter of the Millennium Development Goals. As many of you, as you know, the Millennium Development Goals sort of expire here soon in 2015, and so what's the next chapter between 2015 to 30? And while we've met, and David said to some, in terms of definition, the water goal, there are still 780 million people on the planet today. Even by meeting the Millennium Development Goal, 780 million people still don't have access to clean drinking water. And it's just astounding given that it's 2014 and we've known the solution for some time. It's not in the same vein as some of the larger crises around HIV/AIDS, for instance, or malaria, where we don't have vaccines. We're putting a lot of money in R&D and investing in biomedical research to come up with a cure. Whereas with water and sanitation, we've known how to deliver safe drinking water for hundreds of years. So it's really a matter of will than it is a matter of a cure or some invention or technology. Sure, there are technological advances that we can invest in that may help us reach our goals faster, but most of this is will. And in 2014, the fact that we still live on a planet with 780 million people that don't have access to safe drinking water, the basis of just day-to-day life and basic sanitation is actually unconscionable. And so I think the goal to get to universal coverage, that everyone on the planet could just have that basic amount of water every single day to get through your day of water and basic sanitation by 2030 shouldn't be at all a stretch. So hopefully we'll get there.
Right. So from what I was reading, I'll let you ask something in a second. But there seems to be a shift towards market-driven solutions in the water space. And as opposed to the service delivery of the past. Can you guys paint a picture of like where we've been in this model and where you think we're headed and how we can achieve that universal access?
I think any one of us could answer that question. It'd be kind of an interesting question for every one of us to pick up on. Do you want to speak to that?
I wanted to thank you for having me and thank you for being here. It's good to be in such illustrious company. Now, I don't know as much about water as these two over here. But I wanted to say a couple of things which go to the heart of, I think, what we're discussing. One is this idea of development. And then another, I think, Chevenee, you teed it up, this idea of will and what it will take. I don't know, most of you probably saw, well, I don't know how many of you saw, Bill Gates' letter to his foundation partners, where he was starting to question this notion of development. You know, this bifurcation of the world into developed countries and developing countries, and what really is the divide? Is there a divide? Is it relevant anymore? Should we be rethinking that? And that's a really interesting notion to me, I think, because a lot of really exciting stuff is happening in the so-called developing world that may have to come the other way. And these two at the heart of it in some
We certainly
cases.
need to be conserving water here in Central Texas.
Yeah.
It's getting critical.
Yeah.
And the other one I wanted to put out, it has nothing to do with water, but I think we'll try and wend our way back to it, which is a fact. About a couple of weeks ago, I think the Indian Space Research Organization, which is a government-funded entity, just put up a mission to Mars for about 75% of the money it took to make the movie Gravity. Right? So this is the state of innovation in the world today, and if we applied that kind of thinking to this issue, especially targeting the will of people to make change, I think we'll do well. But
And I would just go on to say that I think it's obvious that, and I'm quoting something that my CEO and co-founder, the founder of Water.org, who's a social entrepreneur, actually supported by the Skoll Foundation, class of 2009. So I'm quoting him by saying there will never be enough charity in the world to solve any one issue.
Right.
Water is just one, but there's just not enough charitable funding in the world. We're all charitable people. Everybody wants to do something, but it's just not possible to solve one problem with charity alone. So market-based solutions and leveraging the capital markets, thinking differently about money and where it comes from, and differently about developing versus developed, and do solutions always have to come from the north versus from the south? Really just recasting a lot of those, I think, old thoughts and old models, and thinking about things differently. I think that's where the innovation is coming, and that is where a lot of the social entrepreneurship space is really driving that forward. And so water credit is one of those examples, but in the context of water, we can't get there just through philanthropy. So we have to think about it differently, and that's where water credit and this market-based solution comes in saying that people are customers. They don't have to be beneficiaries, and in fact, they'd prefer not to if you asked. So that's really the way that we're approaching this, is saying that instead of saying every single community needs to have an NGO come in and dig a well, flipping that on its head and saying, actually, going to communities and saying, what is it that you want? Well, they want what everybody here has, which is, to be able to turn on a faucet in their home and be a paying customer for basic water. So if that is actually quite attainable. If you think about it as, actually, this is a customer base waiting to be discovered, versus saying we have to keep raising infinite amount of charity to dig a well in every community around the world.
So say something more about how your New Ventures Fund is addressing that. Isn't that the angle you're making or taking, is to empower that?
Yeah,
the
yeah.
customers?
So the New Ventures Fund, I'll take a bit of a step back and say that water credit, what I was just speaking to, is a market-based solution that it's taken quite a while to prove it. To be quite honest, and just in terms of sharing best practices and insights, the Skoll Foundation and Pepsico Foundation were early investors in that model. I say investors from a philanthropic perspective. They were investing grant money, and as foundations have to be very selective and strategic about who they invest in, they really sort of, I think, progressive foundations are saying, who should we invest in? Who's going to make the biggest impact? Pepsico Foundation and the Skoll Foundation are tough foundations, frankly, and do their due diligence and find the best entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, the best models that are going to have the biggest impact. And we were very fortunate. Gary White, again, the founder of Water.org, who really had been at this for 2 decades, proved himself, showed the world and demonstrated, I think there's some there here with this concept of saying, people are not beneficiaries, they're customers. Let's actually get them access to financing rather than always digging a well. Financing, so they themselves can say, go to the bank and say, I want to get a water tank. I want a connection to my home. I know what I want. I would like to choose. I need the financing to do that. Mm-hmm. And so after several decades of working on this, saying, I have this model, this could work, Pepsico Foundation and Skoll Foundation said, we think there's some there. And without these two foundations, frankly, we would not have been able to demonstrate the model, the hypothesis that Gary had very early on. And now we're at a point where it's been demonstrated and we're scaling. We're really scaling, and that's one of the questions, and the big questions in development is how do you move beyond pilot into true scale? And so at this point, we've gone from a small idea and testing it and pressure testing around the edges to 330,000 new customers in India alone, which represents over 1 million people getting access to safe water and sanitation by 2016. That's real scale, that's real impact. Now, there's 780 million people that need to be reached, so we've got to reach a whole new level of scale, and that's where the New Ventures Fund, frankly, comes in, is that we decided that there are ways that we can even innovate around the existing water credit model, just sort of chew at the edges of it, and that's where I think a lot of innovation comes from. It's not coming up with a brand new breakthrough idea. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is that transformative opportunity, but a lot of times innovation just comes around the edges of what's already there. The challenge, ironically, is in the nonprofit sector, nonprofits really don't have license to innovate very often. Some are fortunate enough to find partners like Skoll or Pepsico Foundation who understand that and see a promising opportunity in a model and will say, we'll invest in that. But it's actually quite difficult. There are not a lot of funders or donors out there, partners who are willing to go along. And so the New Ventures Fund was really Water.org's response to that, and saying we should raise a fund from like-minded individuals who get that, who come from a VC background, frankly, who come from a startup background, and we will use that fund, that philanthropic fund, to go and to move, to innovate around the edges of water credit. How can we take water credit into new geographies, tweak the model, because frankly, from 1 million to 780 million, we're going to have to innovate, right? We're not going to get there just doing water credit the way that we've done it, to date. So we'll have to innovate that model, but then we'll also have to figure out what's the next water credit, what's that next groundbreaking innovation. So that's truly what we set up the fund to do, and we did a lot of benchmarking in the nonprofit space to figure out who else is doing this, and there were not a lot of examples. So we think that it's actually quite a unique idea that we're trying to, even within the nonprofit space, proliferate and say, we think that other nonprofits should do this.
You guys as funders both get to evaluate a lot of proposals and see what's out there and the innovation. Are there other things that you see that are promising that you want to share with our listeners?
Along the lines of really trying to find ways to take to scale water services and find ways to make the systems that provide water services work. There's a lot of really incredible innovations out there. Chevenee was talking about the people's willingness to pay for water, and that's includes the poor and even some of the extreme poor. There are models that, for example, the Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor, an organization that we are recognizing this year with the Skoll Award, is working with utility providers. Think of like the water company here in Austin, but to help them reach the urban poor and change the way they think about the urban poor, from urban poor to urban customers, to how do you actually work, because the way that you work in a slum in Nairobi is not the same way you work in a middle class neighborhood in Nairobi. And they're finding ways to do things like extend the sewage pipes all the way into the slum areas, and then allow businesses to build on top of that. Businesses like sanitation and water facilities that come in from lots of other players as well. Another organization is innovating around how do you actually charge people for per jerry can out of a hand pump, out of a hand pump in a rural area. How do you charge like 1 penny per jerry can, and then use that funds to pay for an entrepreneur to monitor and be part of, like be there at the actual hand pump, but also to pay for repairs and replacement. Like Brandi was talking about it in the introduction, the fact that so many hand pumps have been installed by organizations and institutions and governments around the world, and yet a huge percentage of them aren't working. So Water for People and IRC, two other great organizations, are really working on this issue of sustainability. How do you build the systems to make sure that those pumps work for a long time and that the people actually have money invested, not just to repair it, but to actually replace it when it breaks? And that's an area that the sector is starting to come to terms with, that it's not enough to just have a group of people responsible for basic maintenance and who are saving money to pay for maintenance of the pumps. They actually need to be able to do major repairs and replacement. And that means partnering really closely with local government. And I was in Uganda in November, and I sat down with the head of the water agency for one of the provincial governments, and he showed me his spreadsheet of, this is what we need to reach every person, every clinic, and every school in our province, and here's all the different districts, and here's the cost. And it was about $19 million for this one sort of like a state province of Uganda. It sounds like, oh, that's doable, right? We could do that. And then you'd have full sustainability, 100% access in one of the poorest regions, in one of the low-income countries of the world. And yet, where does the local government get their funds to do this? From the central government. How much do they get? They get $250,000 a year is more or less their budget. That's not even enough to repair the hand pumps that they have that need repairing today. And there are very few organizations partnering with those governments to help them build the systems to be able to reach sustainability and help them build the systems to be able to charge a penny per jerry can. And the poor, believe it or not, are willing to pay that. And you see local entrepreneurs in small villages, in rural areas, actually setting up systems to have taps to have people pay per jerry can. And that's one of the shifts that we're starting to see. The standard that people will pay for water, and they're willing to if it means that they get sustainable service, because people are tired of promises and water installations that end up breaking.
And oftentimes it's cheaper to pay for it.
Absolutely. Oh my
If you
goodness.
can sign up as an actual customer and pay for it, then the opportunity cost of having to walk for water or wait for water, or a truck comes by and you're sort of
And
paying.
they charge a lot,
They
right?
charge a lot. They can charge
Absolutely.
10 to 15 times what
Right.
what any of us pay for water here
Exactly.
sitting on stage.
Yep.
I want to pick up on that because I think I'm seeing a parallel between the way individuals value water, which they've spoken to eloquently, and all the way companies are starting to value water, and which is in a more holistic sense, right? The pricing models, I think, have been broken. So we come at it as a company, our credo is performance with purpose, which is combining the power of what we do in business with also serving communities that we operate in and social stuff. And the way I think about it is, if you can imagine a diagram, the previous model used to be, here's business and here's the world. They're two separate circles with a bunch of arrows connecting them, right? You have supply chains, you have marketing and advertising. And Pepsico, our view on the world is that there's a big circle called the world, and business is a smaller circle within that. And that sort of expands our ability to think about the connections. So as David mentioned, we're doing a lot of stuff in irrigation, even on crops that we don't really use, because we recognize that in the communities that we operate in, if we don't solve that problem, there is no community, there is no workforce in the long term. So I think that sort of backgrounds Pepsico's approach. And coming to the issue of urban stuff, 70% of the world's going to live in cities in 10 years. And a lot of those cities are not the cities you would expect. The world's largest city in 10 years is going to be Karachi, which is not even on the radar for most people when they talk about urban centers. So we think of that as an opportunity in terms of the infrastructure yet to be built, and how could we partner with just about anybody. And I think that's an exciting phase to enter in, where sort of these distinctions between profit and non-profit and public and private are starting to blur, which is a wonderful thing, I think. Because if we recognize common goals, like getting universal access to clean water, it shouldn't matter what point of view you're coming from, as long as you have the ability to work together and complement each other's efforts.
Right, so where does this money come from? Where does the volume of 17 million for this one state in Uganda come from? How do we collectively pool it and direct it to those places that, is it a sequential thing? How do we get there?
There's no one answer, obviously. There's a need for new sources of finance, new ways to access more funding. There's a need for greater charity, but there's also a need for stronger local governance and the ability for national governments to be able to pay for water and fund water infrastructure with local governments and provincial governments, and to pay for water access in the urban slum areas. But there's also a need for increased new forms of finance, and that's where water.org is doing a fabulous job of really identifying new funding flows and working working with microfinance, but also working upstream from microfinance with some of the
Isn't this
larger
higher level,
companies
like bond level, kind of like large funding?
Absolutely. I mean, and then there's also, there's multilateral and UN, World Bank level funding that also needs to complement. I mean, it's the solution in a middle income country is going to be different than one that doesn't have the resources. And to the extent that it can be local government in the lead and actually building that local governance to actually have the systems to provide the services, you're going to have more sustainability. And the financial systems are a huge part of that solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would just even frame it in saying, rather than I think a traditional development has been quite a linear approach, and I think what I'm hearing and paraphrasing, and what we see is that it's no longer linear; it's multidimensional. And really, it's a portfolio approach, and money has to. I mean, and when you think about $19 million just for one district, or you think about $19 billion, for the top 8 countries in the world, there is capital out there. It's just being creative of where you find that capital, what levers you pull, and what Water.org's philosophy is that actually people who are not accessing water, who should and who want it, represent a big chunk of that capital. But that the prevailing thinking is that people are too poor to pay. And that's just not true. They're paying every day, out of pocket, up to 25% of their disposable income in some places. And that's just crazy. It's really expensive to be poor,
Right.
essentially.
Exactly.
So, do you know of anyone going out and sort of just educating in the way that Ayla before us was talking about, giving people a voice, like telling them to use that voice in a way that they can ask for or demand these kinds of services, and be advocates, for themselves instead of someone coming and trying to save them or do something for them?
I think actually that is a really big trend happening in development, full stop.
Okay.
And particularly in water, and the New Ventures Fund and our conversations, that's an area where we're starting to probe at the edges to say, figure out what is our role in that.
Like community organizing kind of stuff.
Community organizing and saying, rather than using mobile apps to say, okay, where is all our money going so we can report it to our donor community, turning that whole system on its head and saying, actually, what are the technologies that people in communities should have access to so they can then use that as, to voice their concerns, to say to their elected officials, this is what we deserve, right? And we're going to use the power of our vote to do that. There's only so much you can do as an international nonprofit organization. So I think really it's about empowering the local organizations that are already there and already doing that and who already have the infrastructure to do that, so that they can actually focus on some of these particular issues like water. And so that's really where the role of Water.org comes in, is finding who are those social entrepreneurs already on the ground, and where can we come in and help educate folks on water specifically, but hey, you guys understand the community organizing part way better than we do.
Right.
One is actually an interesting example where they've been doing community organizing in the United States for years. A lot of people know one.org, and they're really trying to flip their model also on their head and saying, specifically, how can we do community organizing in countries where we've been sending funding flows, and instead do campaigns so that the 18 to 23-year-old kid in Nairobi who's on Twitter and Facebook, they can sort of create their own movements and their own campaigns and hold their elected officials accountable.
If I could add something, I'm also interested in how that 18-year-old connects to these people.
Yeah.
Right? We're in a position where we're extremely water privileged. I mean, we use the same quality water to wash dishes, to drink, to flush our toilets. And there's waste in that. We're not personally responsible for the waste because it's built into the systems that we're part of. But once we recognize that, is there a way to connect this idea of privilege to the 18-year-old in Nairobi?
Well, as we wrap up, I would love for you guys to leave people with a thought or an idea or suggestion of a way they can take personal action in their lives or get involved in one of the organizations that you want to share.
Well, there's a lot of fabulous organizations working on this issue that, that welcome your participation. Water.org is one. There's a whole slew of them, and I won't go into them all now because it would take me a little while. That you can look at our website and find quite a few water and sanitation organizations that we think are fabulous innovators in the world. But
And
also
that's Skoll.
at skollfoundation.org. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's and also talk with local government and even your members of Congress. The Water for World Act in the Congress funds a lot of innovative, interesting stuff through the U.S. government as well. So make it an issue. Get involved locally, nationally, with organizations, with government,
and with brands.
Mm-hmm.
You've probably heard this phrase: people don't buy brands anymore; they join them. So I'm really interested in the power of some of our most powerful brands to start a movement around exactly the same thing. And if we do, I hope all of you will join. And if you came to this event not knowing what PepsiCo's place in this world is, I hope you have a bit of an answer now.
So I would say it's such a relevant topic of conversation right now here in Central Texas. My family's from Austin, and we rented a home here on the holidays out on the lake, if you can call it that.
The former lake.
The former
pond.
lake. It was heartbreaking. It was absolutely heartbreaking. And I brought my fiance for the first time to Austin. I was like, we're gonna go to the lake. We're gonna Charlie and Carlos heard of the lake, and it's just like that whole world just doesn't exist anymore. So I would say, first, recognizing that sort of the preciousness of water and in your daily life. And I think we can all do our part, is little tips like, turning the faucet off when you're brushing your teeth, things like that. But I think here, particularly in Texas and in the Southwest, in the United States, people are recognizing how precious of a resource water is and not taking it for granted.
Irrigation is our biggest problem.
Yeah.
Lawns, specifically.
Yeah.
Like half our water goes to lawns,
Yeah.
which feed nobody. So.
Feed nobody, but are beautiful, right? And so it is really about rethinking our relationship to water and being more conscious and just being more respectful of the resource here in our own country. And obviously, that's not going to replace water for someone else somewhere else in the world. But I think it starts with you and your own actions. And frankly, it's going to be tougher for us to start to build movements for other countries and for other communities because we're starting to feel water stressed here. So thinking about your own footprint and then also recognizing that we're in an interconnected world here. It's not linear, it's multidimensional, and that if you have an interest or have a passion in really digging into this more, go to the Skoll Foundation website, go to water.org's website, learn more about it, and recognize that there are ways that you can actually support our global community so that everyone has basic access to water because it's just the right thing to do.
Thank you. You guys are wonderful, and I hope you'll check out their websites and get involved and pay attention to this very critical issue.
Yeah,
Thanks
thanks
so
so
much.
much.